This is not how middle powers navigate great power competition. A country faces pressure from its largest trading partner. Officials assume capitulation is inevitable. Economic dependence appears absolute. And then, without announcement, that country signs agreements with the rival superpower that transform economic relationships and force both giants to compete for access rather than assume compliance. By the time Washington recognizes what happened, Beijing is already negotiating terms. By the time Beijing understands the strategy, European partners have formalized agreements. And the middle power that was supposed to choose sides has instead made both sides negotiate for position. Most people think geopolitical alignment is binary. Countries either side with the United States or align with China. The assumption is that middle powers must choose because economic dependence creates political subordination. That assumption is what Canada has spent the last year systematically dismantling. What I am describing is documented trade policy and diplomatic positioning that Canada has implemented since early 2026. The agreements are signed. The infrastructure investments are operational. The strategic reorientation is measurable in trade flows and diplomatic outcomes. Public conversation about Canada's position in U.S.-China competition assumed Ottawa would maintain traditional Atlantic alignment. Geographic proximity, cultural ties, defense integration through NORAD, and economic integration all suggested Canada would remain within the American sphere, regardless of tensions with Washington. The assumption was that Canada had no alternatives. Chinese market access required accepting political conditions Ottawa found unacceptable. European partnerships could supplement but not replace American trade. The arithmetic of economic dependence meant Canada would ultimately defer to American preferences. That assumption stopped being accurate when Mark Carney's government decided to test whether alternatives actually existed, or whether their impossibility was simply assumed without verification. This is where strategic patience meets systematic exploration of options. The China trade agreement announced in January 2026 represents the clearest example of how Canada converted apparent impossibility into negotiated reality. For years, Canadian officials assumed that meaningful trade expansion with China required political concessions on Huawei, South China Sea positions, and human rights criticism. The assumption proved incorrect when Canadian negotiators discovered that China valued access to Canadian resources and agricultural products enough to separate trade from political positions. The agreement structure is revealing. Canada provides limited market access for Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for Chinese investment in Canadian manufacturing facilities, technology transfer for battery production, and guaranteed purchases of Canadian canola at volumes exceeding previous trade levels. The sophistication lies in recognizing that both sides benefit economically, while neither surrenders political positions. Canada maintains criticism of Chinese domestic policies while expanding trade. China gains access to resources and agricultural markets while accepting that trade partners need not endorse Chinese political systems. The immediate effect was a $3 billion increase in Canadian agricultural exports to Chinese markets. Canadian canola farmers who faced collapsed revenues when China restricted purchases suddenly had guaranteed access to markets that American farmers cannot reach due to U.S.-China tensions. The political effect in the United States was immediate. American agricultural states watching Canadian farmers gain Chinese market access, while American farmers remained locked out, created pressure on Washington to reconsider its approach to Canada. The pressure came not from Ottawa, but from American constituencies, recognizing that antagonizing Canada created advantages for Canadian competitors. This is how leverage operates, through creating alternatives rather than through threats. The European Union partnership formalized in March 2026 follows similar logic. Canada expanded defense industrial cooperation with European NATO members in ways that reduced dependence on American defense contractors, while maintaining NATO commitments. Canadian companies integrate into European supply chains for military systems. European firms gain access to Canadian critical minerals under processing arrangements that build Canadian industrial capacity. The Arctic infrastructure development represents the geographic component of strategic reorientation. The Port of Churchill expansion and Hudson Bay Railway upgrades create trade routes that bypass American territory entirely. Canadian exports reach European and Asian markets through northern routes that American policy cannot disrupt. By mid-2026, Canadian grain was reaching European markets through Churchill rather than through Great Lakes ports that transit American territory. The shift was substantial enough to demonstrate that Canadian trade could flow without American permission or American infrastructure. The critical minerals policy exemplifies how Canada converted resource extraction into industrial policy. Instead of exporting lithium, nickel, and cobalt as raw materials, Canada now requires that exports consist of processed materials or finished products manufactured in Canadian facilities. The policy forces foreign companies wanting Canadian resources to build processing capacity in Canada, creating employment and technological capabilities rather than simply extracting materials. Chinese, European, and American companies all face the same requirement: Access to Canadian resources requires investment in Canadian industrial capacity. The American response has been revealing. Initial reactions included threats of retaliation, suggestions that Canada was betraying alliance commitments, and predictions that Chinese partnerships would damage Canadian sovereignty. The rhetoric assumed Canada would retreat when confronted with American disapproval. Canadian policy has not retreated. Instead, each American threat has accelerated Canadian diversification as proof that dependence on American goodwill creates vulnerability that alternatives can address. By late 2026, the trade data shows structural rather than temporary shifts. Canadian exports to the United States declined measurably, while exports to China and Europe increased substantially. The changes reflect infrastructure and contractual commitments that persist regardless of political rhetoric. American agricultural exports face increased competition from Canadian producers who secured market access through diplomatic agreements, while American farmers remain constrained by U.S.-China tensions. The competitive disadvantage reflects structural changes in trade relationships that American policy choices created. The technology sector shows similar patterns. Canadian AI research institutions formalized partnerships with European and Asian universities that reduce reliance on American technology firms. The partnerships involve joint research, shared intellectual property, and coordinated development of alternatives to American-dominated platforms. Chinese interpretation of Canadian strategy has evolved substantially. Initial Beijing assessments viewed Canada as an American satellite, incapable of independent positioning. Canadian persistence in maintaining expanded China trade, despite American criticism, forced Beijing to reassess. Chinese officials now recognize that Canada can sustain positions that Washington opposes because Canadian alternatives make American pressure less effective than previously assumed. This creates space for deeper engagement based on transactional rather than ideological relationships. European perspective on Canadian strategy has been largely supportive. European countries facing pressure to choose between American and Chinese economic relationships recognize Canadian approach as a model for maintaining trade with both while surrendering sovereignty to neither. The geographic advantage Canada possesses is becoming increasingly apparent. Arctic shipping routes opening due to climate change provide alternatives to maritime choke points that either superpower could theoretically control. Canadian territorial waters in the Northwest Passage create options that make Canadian trade less vulnerable to great power conflict. The agricultural sector transformation demonstrates how quickly strategic reorientation produces measurable results. Canadian canola exports to China increased by billions within months of the trade agreement. Saskatchewan and Manitoba farmers experienced income increases that exceeded projections, because Chinese market access eliminated price pressure created when American farmers dominated export markets. The political effect creates domestic support for continued diversification strategy. Canadian farmers who benefit from Chinese market access oppose policies that would sacrifice that access to restore exclusive American alignment. The constituency for strategic autonomy grows as economic benefits become tangible. Canadian critical mineral processing facilities are being designed to serve multiple markets rather than primarily American customers. The approach creates flexibility that reduces vulnerability to any single customer's policy changes. The defense industrial implications are equally significant. Canadian integration into European defense supply chains creates alternatives to American defense contractors while maintaining NATO interoperability. The approach does not eliminate American defense partnerships, but ensures they are not exclusive. The long-term pattern is clear. Canada is systematically building economic, technological, and diplomatic relationships that create alternatives to exclusive American alignment without requiring exclusive Chinese or European alignment. The strategy is diversification rather than realignment. The sophistication lies in recognizing that middle powers facing pressure from great powers can convert that pressure into justification for building alternatives. American threats accelerated Canadian diversification. Chinese skepticism about Canadian independence created opportunities to prove capabilities. European interest in alternatives to great power dependence provided willing partners. By the time both Washington and Beijing fully recognize Canadian strategy, the alternatives will be operational enough that reversing them becomes impractical. The infrastructure is built, the contracts are signed, the trade flows are established. This is not how middle powers were supposed to navigate great power competition. This is how they navigate when leadership recognizes that alternatives exist if pursued systematically rather than assumed to be impossible. The leverage comes not from choosing sides, but from making both sides compete for position. And the power to make superpowers compete comes from building alternatives that make compliance unnecessary. Canada has proven that geography, resources, and strategic patience can create autonomy even for countries that appear structurally dependent. The proof is measurable in trade data, diplomatic agreements, and infrastructure that operates regardless of superpower preferences. This is how middle powers become autonomous. And autonomy, once achieved through systematic strategy, reshapes relationships permanently.